Hi, this is David Unsworth, English editor of the PanAm Post. Today we'll be talking with Loren Moss, publisher of Finance Colombia, an English-language publication focusing on economic, financial, and business news targeting investment professionals. Loren recently participated in the Andes Bonds, Loans, and Derivatives Conference, which focused on Colombia's ambitious 4G, or fourth generation, infrastructure plan. Loren, thanks for being with us today.
Absolutely, it's an honor.
So to begin with, what is Colombia's 4G program and how will it change the future of the country?
The 4G Highway Initiative in Colombia is a roughly $30 billion plan to modernize and upgrade Colombia's road infrastructure. Colombia has traditionally suffered from poor connectivity over the roads. That's to say, the roads that they have are generally well maintained, but they're small and of a low capacity, and generally are low velocity roads. And with Colombia being a mountainous country, has suffered from frequent mudslides, and it generally takes a long time and is very expensive to move cargo and passengers throughout the country. So the government is on this plan to make a major upgrade and really modernize the infrastructure especially between cities.
What are the major routes? I would imagine, obviously, we're talking about Bogota, Medellin, Cali, that kind of triangle in the middle of the country, and connecting the coast with the Andean region. What are the top priorities right now?
Exactly. The plan calls for building about 5,000 miles of additional two-lane highway and another 2,200 miles of four-lane highway. That's something that the country has not had. Even right now, if you were to go between Bogota and Medellin, only part of that distance is four-lane highway. So that means that the traffic is very slow. It takes a long time. Also, as you mentioned, the traffic between the coast, the traffic, say, to go from the Pacific port of Buenaventura into the closest major city, which would be Cali, is something that has taken a much longer time than it would over a similar geography in other cities.
Oh, yes.
That's also,
I've gone on that road, and it is inadequate, to say the least. Why is improving Colombia's highways so critical to driving economic growth?
Well, if you look at a country like Mexico, if you've been to Mexico and you've been over the road between cities, the freeways in Mexico, at least the major ones, really don't even look any different than they do in the U.S. You have 6-lane highways between the cities, and you have that run at a high velocity as they do in the United States. In Colombia, for example, the distance between Bogota and Medellin, that's only 153 miles. That's slightly that's not far at all. However, by ground, because you have two mountain ranges that you're traversing, you're talking about 330 miles or so, and that's less than the distance between Columbus, Ohio, and Chicago, Illinois. But you're talking about a 5-hour trip versus here in Colombia, an 11-hour trip. Now, if you want to go from somewhere like the Caribbean coast city of Barranquilla into a place like Medellin, that's a trip that is 18 hours over the road nonstop, and so and that's if you don't have any accidents, if you don't have any delays, if you don't have any mudslides or anything like that. And that weak spot has meant that it's very expensive to transport cargo. It's very risky in terms of if you have perishable goods or that kind of thing. And they haven't been able to compete with other countries that have better infrastructure and things like that's one of the reasons you don't see a lot of heavy manufacturing in Colombia, because you just can't move efficiently or effectively the machinery or the finished cargo around the country and out to the ports, and so that's holding the country back, and it's been a decelerant of GDP growth.
Now, where you were talking about the difference between the single-lane highways and what we call here the Doble Quezada, now is part of the 4G plan to build a multiple-lane highway, let's say at least 2 lanes in each direction between Bogota and Medellin, or is it only going to be a portion of that route?
there are about 30 different projects underway with the 4G in various stages of planning. There are already some projects that are under construction. There are some projects now that are in the licitation or the bid process, and of course these are, generally speaking, public-private partnerships, which is the preferred way of doing things down here.
Sure.
And then there's a third tranche of projects that are still kind of in the planning and surveying stages, but and they're on the drawing board, but they haven't gone out yet for the bidding process. So it's kind of a three-phase project, and some of these are already under construction. To my knowledge, I don't believe that expanding the roads between, let's say, Medellin and Puerto Triunfo, which is kind of the halfway point between Medellin and Bogota, is part of the 4G project. Now, one thing that's important to clarify: Colombia overall has a $70 billion highway and transportation infrastructure master plan that's already underway. If you've been to, let's say, the airports in Medellin or Bogota, you'll see that both airports are under expansion. The Santa Marta airport, my editor, Jared Wade, just told me he was there. I think he got back yesterday, and he said that it's amazing what they've done. And so there are other highway projects that have expansions and tunnel building underway that are not necessarily part of the 4G project. So
Sure.
even if they are expanding Medellin to Bogota, that I don't think is under the 4G financing plan, even though that may be a highway expansion that's underway here in Colombia.
Yes, I've flown out of all three of those airports within the past couple of months, and it's quite impressive what they've done in Medellin and Santa Marta, not to mention Bogota. Now, explain to us why Colombia has been pursuing a public-private partnership as the major vehicle for financing infrastructure and transportation investments.
Well, if you look at the 4G financing plan, it's roughly $30 billion. Now, the entire transportation infrastructure improvement plan that Colombia has, I think it's a master plan that goes out to 2025 or something like that, is a $70 billion overall plan. So the airport expansions are not part of the 4G, but they are underway and they are being financed by other vehicles here in Colombia. And if you're looking at $30 billion, not even the $70 billion, but just the $30 billion number, that's like an eighth of the GDP. The Colombia government budget is $120 billion, and so they don't have the resources with everything else and all the other challenges in a developing country to go and say, do it the U.S. model and just where the government's going to fund the interstate highway system. So they've used the public-private partnerships as a lever, or like we would say down here, a palanca, to be able to raise that money. And so what they're doing is they're giving a concession. So they're saying, okay, you come in and we'll support a private company or a consortium with financing support and put the government's credit behind the financing, and you're going to build this construction project, and then you'll be able to charge tolls over the next 25 years, and you'll recoup your investment based on that, and you'll also manage that. So you've seen we have toll roads in different parts of the U.S., but really by leveraging and getting private companies to come in and not just to build but to maintain the roads, still with some government participation and with some government oversight, of course, they've been able to use the private sector in kind of a win-win way, without having to do something like we would maybe do in the U.S. and raise gas taxes or something to that effect. And they're able to pay for this. They're able to still maintain some oversight and make sure that the communities are served and that kind of thing. But they're able to do it by inviting in private sector entities to run and maintain these roads. And as we've seen in a lot of places, to do a much better job than probably would happen if it were just up to the government.
Yes, two roads that come to mind are, for example, the road between Pereira and Medellin, which I've traveled on recently, and I thought it was quite impressive, and the new route that they're putting in that's going to be Doble Quezada between Villavicencio and Bogota. So I would imagine those are both being financed under the public-private partnership that we're discussing.
The Viavo route, I'm pretty sure is. I was down that way recently. I went between Bogota and Viavo, or more correctly, Villavicencio, and the 4G, and it's very impressive when you see the bridges and the infrastructure that's being built and the quality. You can look at it and see that it's being done, and you know that route is very impressive. Some of the mountainsides, and even the tunnel you go through when you go between Cundinamarca and Meta, and they are investing in really making that, I guess, leapfrog and going from underdeveloped to the most modern, and it's impressive to see that it looks like, I'm no auditor and I haven't been in there to look at their books, but just from the construction work, it does look like they're doing it right, and it's very impressive.
So the major player we are talking about here is the ANAE, the Agencia Nacional de Infraestructura, or National Infrastructure Agency. They have assured potential investors that they've streamlined development and implemented plans to keep projects on schedule. What specific steps have they been taking to encourage investment?
They have modernized the bidding process at the bonds, loans, and derivatives conference that you mentioned. The president of the ANI gave an update, if you would, kind of a presentation on where they were with that. They've modernized so the government can come in and work and do a lot of the kind of environmental pre-work and help with the permitting processes and things that otherwise would take much longer to do. And because they've planned this out so far, they can begin this as part of a master plan versus, say, a regional department here in Colombia, or if somebody said, well, let's just build a road between these two cities. By knowing, hey, in 2019, we expect to be doing this project over here, they can already work on the permitting and the pre-work and the land rights and those kinds of issues that need to be done. And they're doing that, and also by streamlining the financing. What they're doing is the government is kind of not completely as an intermediary, but as a guarantor, and they're packaging the finance, which makes it easier to raise the money. So they'll go out and say, okay, we need to raise $200 million for this, and now that money comes in and it's in the fund, and so it's ready to be dispersed, versus having to do it on a piece by piece way, which would make it take much longer, because you've got to raise the money, then you've got to get the permitting and do the engineering work, and so they've helped with that. They've also helped with and the projects are generally on track, and they've helped with the transparency. They've worked with some of the multinational organizations, and it's been a surprisingly, but also refreshingly scandal-free project or process. You have things here and there, little things, but you don't have any kind of issues like, if you remember, the historical carousel de contratos that we had in Bogota.
Sure, Samuel Moreno.
A corruption mess. The metro of Medellin, which now is great, but it was very much an adventure when that was getting built, and so they've really been able to help. It's funny because you hear and you say, okay, well, the government's going to get involved, it's going to mess it up, but they haven't. They're not building the roads, they're not doing that, but they are helping with the financing and the disbursement and keeping things systematic, so that it's part of this master plan versus let's build a road here, let's build a road there, and having it done that way, and having an organization that's coordinating that. It does look like they've learned lessons and seem to be doing it right.
So in conjunction with the theme of modernization, Colombia consistently receives high marks for investor protection. What steps did the government take in order to make this a priority?
Colombia has a great history and an almost unique history in Latin America, and really in developing countries in general. Colombia does not have a record of ever nationalizing private property. Private property, for whatever other challenges the country has had historically, has always been well respected. You don't have, like we just had in Argentina, where properties were nationalized, or you look at the nightmare just next door in Venezuela. Those kinds of things have never, are just not part of Colombia's history, and so Colombia already has a good reputation. As someone who does business down here, I can say that there's a lot of predictability and reliability in terms of the legal structure. You sort of know what's going to happen. It's not and Wild West, like a lot of people that have done business in other parts of the world would think. And another thing that's very important in this is that the government has assumed a lot of the currency rate risk. Currencies, and especially currencies in countries that are commodities exporters like Colombia, can be volatile, especially in light of export cycles, of raw goods cycles, and that kind of thing. And so the government has come in and said to investors, we will mitigate in the way that we structure this financing. The government will accept and take away some of the currency risk. I mean, there's some there, but they'll say there's going to be a backstop. They work kind of as an insurance company, and they say that your currency, you cannot lose more than so much if there were a currency fluctuation or a large drop in let's say the price of the Colombian peso against the dollar or other benchmark currencies. And so that structure that's been put into the financing has really helped make it easier. At the conference, we were on stage with some of the banks, a lot of the major banks that are participating in this financing. And for the international banks especially, that has been something to entice them to participate. And then even for the domestic banks, it helps them, because if that currency risk is taken away, then when the ratings companies, and all of them were there, Fitch was there, Standard & Poor's, Moody's, when they look at the domestic banks, they ask, what is the bank's currency risk exposure? What is, okay, their assets are in pesos. If the pesos drops, the bank's assets drop. And so we have to take that into account. So if the banks are financing, and the majority of the financing is coming from local institutions, then they're able to have less risk, not a risk of default, but less of a risk to their balance sheets. And that helps make the financing easier.
Now, tell us about the role that ECAs, or export credit agencies, will be playing in financing upcoming projects.
A lot of it is technical. They've helped in structuring loans for the international markets. The IADB has assisted, the Inter-American Development Bank has assisted in writing enabling legislation. Colombia's equity markets and capital markets are very young and relatively immature, and so a lot of the legislation simply hasn't been there to make these kinds of financing projects easy. I was just at the Col Capital, which is the Colombian Private Equity Trade Association's conference last Friday, and their director was telling me that 13 years ago, the laws to even do something like private equity or venture capital, the regulatory framework wasn't even here. And so the IADB and some of these other organizations like World Bank, they've come in and helped with technical assistance to be able to enable this kind of financing now and in the future. And then the IFC, the International Finance Corporation, has issued financing guarantees and invested directly. I think they've invested over $100 million so far directly in the project. They gave $50 million into a debt fund, and then directly into the Colombia's Infrastructure Development Bank, the FDN. They've invested $70 million directly into that, and that money will be passed through into the 4G project.
You recently moderated a panel on sustainable finance at the Andes Bonds, Loans, and Derivatives Conference. What steps is Colombia taking to balance environmental concerns with economic growth?
Well, that conference was really more about the financing side of things. It was more for example, Colombia is in the process of looking at how they can update legislation. There already is some legislation. There already is a framework in place so that Colombia can issue green bonds, and so that Colombia can do sustainable financing projects. And there are banks that are already participating in that right now. Bank Colombia just issued its first green bond, and these are financing projects that might have certain tax advantages and other benefits that are used to finance sustainable projects. And that sustainable project may be something traditional in Colombia. As you know, we have a lot of hydroelectric power down here. It may be something like solar or wind or some of these things that we traditionally think of when we think of green or sustainable. It can be things like agricultural projects and agricultural modernization. And it could even be something like if you have a motorcycle manufacturer and you're just going to go from making one internal combustion engine to a more efficient internal combustion engine, that can actually qualify in some cases for green financing if you can show an improvement. And so it's really been about taking steps to do that. Now, the government has taken steps to address some environmental aspects here in Colombia, and they're getting better at that. There was a case recently where out in Boyacá, a local woman, and this is something that wouldn't have happened 20 years ago, but a local woman bought a claim about some I think it was a mining company, and she said it was going to mess with her personal water supply, and the government actually stopped the project and not stopped it permanently, but they said, okay, let's go through a procedure and ascertain if this isn't or is not the case. And so, not that you want to stop all development projects, but the point is that there's a protocol in place, and that everybody's rights, property rights, are looked at and respected.
That I would imagine that suit was filed through a what we call here in Colombia a tutela.
Oh, let me see. I don't remember. Yes, actually, it was an acción de tutela. You're correct.
Tutela, that's it. That's the word I'm looking for. And just so our listeners know, Boyacá is a large Colombian state, just about let's say 50 miles north of Bogotá. Finally, where do you see the Colombian peso headed in the coming year, and how does the recent depreciation of Latin American currencies, especially those that are so heavy on commodities export, like, say, Colombia and Brazil and Venezuela, how is this going to affect the capacity of the government to finance these projects?
Well, if I really knew the answer to that, of course, I would be probably in my jet somewhere,
Sure.
Flying to Wall Street. But at least as a journalist or analyst, I could take a stab, and of course we know that the Colombian pesos and generally the currencies and commodity export countries, like even Chile, which has a relatively advanced economy, yet is still very much dependent on copper. These currencies the Colombian peso is highly correlated with petroleum prices. In Colombia, as you know, somewhere between 45 and 53% of their foreign currency exchange comes from petroleum exports. We also have the China deceleration that's had a big effect. Well, again, on places like Chile and Peru and also Brazil. Mexico right now is affected by the political risk with, of course, its marriage, so to speak, with the United States. But I think that we had a big drop in petroleum prices, and we saw the peso shoot up. I think for a while it was at 3,300 to the dollar.
Yeah, even briefly touched 3,400 at one point.
Yeah, and
very briefly.
That put a squeeze on inflation, and it put a squeeze on the everyday Colombian consumer, and then also on the government itself. But I think that I don't think that the petroleum is going to drop anymore. If anything, it's going to start to creep up as we enter into a period of what looks like some political uncertainty. But even still, I think that with Colombia showing signs of not so much political stabilization, because that's been pretty stable, but with this peace process and with the optimism and with the way that Colombia is viewed in the eyes of investors improving, I don't see any. I mean, you never know what could happen, but I don't see any shocks or anything, any big threats to the currency on the horizon. So my own guess would be that we'll expect to see the currency really sit stable. The economy is very slow right now, so I don't think that it's going to strengthen very much, and I don't think that the government wants it to strengthen very much. I would be surprised if it fluctuates more than 5% either way between now and the end of the year. But then again, I'm not a currency speculator or an expert, so that's my quasi-amateur prognostication for you.
Great. Well, Loren, thank you so much for being with us. We really appreciate it, and hopefully sometime in the future we can have you on again.
It's been an honor, and I'm
All right.
available anytime. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Goodbye.